Having the skills to design for yourself without always needing to turn to a designer can be really helpful. While you might want to hire a designer for the big overall branding of your business, it's really helpful if you have some design skills so that you can tackle little things here and there along the way, like maybe some social media graphics or on the fly sudden promotions that you want to just put together. If you have those skills to design yourself, it's so much easier to just quickly whip it up without having to constantly ask someone to help you out. I see a lot of small businesses trying to tackle their own graphics, but I've noticed a lot of key mistakes that people are always making. Often these people have hired someone for maybe their logo or some of their branding elements, but they've tried to tackle little things like a banner or a promotion or a social media image on their own because it's quicker and it saves them money. So if you like the ability to be able to tackle some of those things on your own, but you don't have a lot of design knowledge, in this video I'll tackle 3 main mistakes that I see people making and how you can fix them so that you'll have much better graphics and your designs are going to look so much more professional. Often the mistakes are just tiny little things where if you just make little tweaks, it can make a huge difference from going from looking unprofessional and untidy to neat, simple and professional. So if you're tired of your graphics looking dated, unprofessional, unbalanced or poorly executed, then this video will really help you. Training your eye for design can take a lot of work. So if you know some of the key principles and some little tweaks that can help make your designs better, it's really going to help, because if you're just relying on your eye alone and you haven't got a lot of experience in design, then you'll be able to turn to those things to make sure that your designs are good, rather than just hoping that you'll just be able to look at it and know what's wrong or right. So the first mistake, this is using the grid and alignment. So often people just place things in by eye rather than making sure that things line up properly. Or you may just simply be lining up 1 or 2 things but not everything. When it comes to design, something that's really helpful is using a grid. When I first discovered the grid concept, this to me was just such an eye-opener, because so long I'd been looking at magazines and layouts and wondering how they came up with those things, and when I realized the concept of the grid, everything sort of fell into place a lot more. I could really see the reasoning behind why people would place things in certain ways and how you can create better designs by understanding the grid. Now this doesn't have to be super complicated. If you look here, this is an example of what I mean by the grid. So we're looking basically at columns, also horizontal lines. So basically we're trying to make sure that things line up. First of all, you need to decide how many columns you want to base your design grid on. So for example, something quite simple, you may just want to use 2 columns. So then everything needs to line up with those things. So you're going to have things that will be on the left, things on the right, and things that go across both columns. That's a very simple example of using the grid. But then what you're doing by using it is making sure that everything that's half size is all lined up correctly, exactly the same both sides, and anything that goes right across finishes and starts in that same spot, and also the gap in between is always the same, and then your design is going to look so much more neat. And then if you want to get into something more complicated, using more columns, like 3 columns, where some things go across 2, some things go across 3, and some things only go across 1. But because you've used that grid as a base, everything is going to look good no matter what. And then also taking into mind horizontal, so making sure that text all lines up horizontally, whether it's over here or over there, it always has the same baseline. And also making sure like an image lines up with where the text is over here. All those little things can make such a big difference. People don't realize just how big a difference something so small like alignment can make. It's also very handy when you've got a lot of information, because it can help organize in a way that looks structured and flows well, and it isn't going to be overwhelming. And when you're trying to design something, you've got a structure to base it on, and it's going to make the job of designing so much easier for you. So here's some quick examples. This one is using no grid. This one is using a 1-column grid. This one uses a 2-column grid. And this one uses a 3-column grid. So you can see, using the same content, how you can design it in different ways by using the grid, and how messy it looks when you don't use a grid. Mistake number 2 is font choice. Perhaps I'm being too much of a graphic designer font nerd, but I often see poor font choice ruining what could have been good design. Often people are choosing fonts for the wrong reasons. Maybe it's because it's a free font, maybe it's just a personal favorite of theirs, maybe it's something that came with the software they were using. Often people are choosing fonts for the wrong reasons and not really thinking through why they're using that font. And also being careful about how they pair fonts and making sure that if they use more than one font, that those fonts go well together. easier. And the other mistake is poor spacing. So I don't want to get too much into the technical terms of typography and confuse you, but you want to be sure that you're careful with how you space letters out, how you space your lines out, that you're being careful with your typography and it's not getting messy or just using defaults or trying to get too fancy and making a mess of it. So when it comes to font choice, things you should consider is the message you're trying to get across. What is your brand all about? If it's a sophisticated brand, you don't want a font that doesn't look sophisticated. And you want to be careful of using fonts that are overused. There are some fonts out there that, because they're free fonts and everyone has access to them and they're cool and trendy right now, they end up getting overused and everyone's using them. And they start to look dated and ugly because they're just so overused. So take the time to pick out fonts that suit your brand, that send the message that you want to send. Is it sophisticated? Is it elegant? Is it feminine? Is it sending that message? And then sometimes it's even a wise investment to buy fonts. Remember, if it's your brand fonts, it's not like you're going to have to buy hundreds of fonts. You probably only need to buy 2 to 3 fonts maximum. So sometimes doing that can create something more unique, that you're not going to look like everyone else, and it's not going to be one of those fonts that look cheap. It's going to look much more professional, much more beautiful, because you've taken the time to choose a font that really suits your brand and is also a higher end quality font. Another thing to consider is, who do you want it to appeal to? So who is your audience? What kind of fonts are actually going to appeal to them, not just your own personal taste. So along with that is also font colors. So a lot of people will just go for black, but black doesn't always suit every single brand. Sometimes a dark gray can suit better. So you've got to make sure that you're not just choosing it by default and you're actually thinking through what's suiting my brand. And then when it came to spacing, strange kerning. So I know that's a bit of a technical typography term, but you want to be sure that your spacing is nice and neat, that the letters are evenly spaced out and they're not some tight, some further apart, or you're not spacing things out really wide because that's cool and trendy when it actually looks weird. So a common example I see is when people use script fonts, fonts that are supposed to flow together, where each of the letters are supposed to link up, and they've spaced them out and it just looks ridiculous because that's not how the font was designed. The font was designed for each letter to link to one another, and then they put huge gaps in it and it just looks tacky. Spacing can be really effective in design, but if you're using it poorly, it's just going to look bad. And the final mistake is not considering hierarchy. So I'll show you 2 examples. In this example, the design has not considered hierarchy at all, whereas in this example, the design has considered hierarchy. So what do I mean by hierarchy? This means considering what is the most important element and what's the least important element, and then in order from there, and making sure that the eye flows nicely and people are seeing what they need to see first, that you're actually thinking about what's the most important element here and balancing those elements out really well. Sometimes this can be really obvious. Obviously the title needs to be the biggest, most obvious thing, but sometimes people forget about some of the things after that. Like, oh, people need to see my website, that has to be huge. But really, the most important thing was actually your call to action for that particular promo, and your website was more of a branding and copyright type thing, and it needed to be more small down the bottom. And it's about the balance too, so that things are seen in the right order, so that things flow and the eye knows where to move. It's not just about, oh, this needs to be big and this needs to be small, but how do you make it balance nicely and flow well so that the eye isn't confused and people know where to look and when to look, so that your design is easy on the eye and not confusing and overwhelming. Also, when it comes to adding in photography, look at where the eye is looking. What is the image drawing the person's eye to? So remembering those examples I showed you before, the girl is putting her arms out, so she's pointing in a direction. It's the same if you use a photo where someone's eyes are looking at something. Are their eyes looking at what you want the person to read, or are they looking off the page? Because if they're looking off the page, then you're not getting someone to focus their attention on what you want them to focus on. So it can seem like the subtlest of things, but making sure that everything is directing the eye in the right way. So if you use a photo of a person, make sure that the eye is looking at the main point that you want them to look at, thing that's most important, and then from there things flow. You've really got to think about how you put all the elements together so that things flow properly and so that there's some balance and hierarchy there, because you don't want your message to be lost and you don't want people to be confused. You want your images to be easily read and understood. So I hope these 3 tips helped you out when it comes to designing better graphics for your business. And if you want more tips about graphic design, visual branding, and supporting your creativity, then be sure to subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you next time.